I'm going to give you a little bit of a national overview of what the WEB's research program is all about, and then basically my main objective today is just to let you know which agricultural BMPs are being studied at the 4 different locations in Western Canada, and just I'll conclude with a few thoughts about place-based watershed scale research. Before I really get started though, I just want to acknowledge the leads of the 4 Western WEB's program sites, and just acknowledge that a lot of the information I'm sharing and some of the slides are in thanks to them and their work. So the WEB's program is really designed to help us understand environmental and economic performance of agricultural BMPs, and this is done over 9 different locations across Canada, and each of the locations kind of operates independently on its own from the other locations, but under the umbrella of WEB's and some of the WEB's research methods, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute. And we've been calling this I guess a place-based watershed scale research model because each of the watersheds, of course, have their own unique environmental challenges, and each of the teams in those locations and with some of the local stakeholders decided which agricultural BMPs should be researched at those locations based on the environmental issues they're facing. The watershed research is actually done on real farms with farmers, so each of the individual 9 sites has contracts with the farmers on whose land the research is done. And the evaluations also involve modeling to scale up the smaller watershed findings to larger, more regional watersheds. So in 2004, there were initially 7 sites established, and then in 2009, 2 more sites were established on Pipestone Creek, Saskatchewan, and Souris River, PEI. So one of the main objectives of WEB's is to evaluate BMP's effects on the environment and on farms, and use water quality as a primary indicator, but other indicators are also evaluated under WEB's, things like riparian area health or rangeland health, and I'll talk about a few other ones. And really WEB's is trying to answer questions about which BMPs within a watershed are the most beneficial for the farm or for the environment. What is the economic impact on the farms, or the economics of, in terms of public good or public stewardship? Where in the landscape should we be putting some of these BMPs, and what factors are driving the performance of BMPs? So why evaluate them at a watershed scale? I think Amy covered this quite well. Really the watersheds provide a naturally bounded system, and unlike plots or field scale, within a watershed we can look at the complexity of the soils, the topography, the hydrology, and capture all the interactions between the landscape processes and how the BMPs change those processes, or how those processes change due to the BMP effects. By testing BMPs in a watershed, we can compare individual BMPs to see which ones maybe are best for the watershed, but we can also look at the cumulative impact of multiple BMPs and see what effect that has on reducing nutrient loading, for example. So all of the WEB's research sites across Canada do the biophysical environmental evaluations, and they do on-farm economic assessments. Some of them are also getting into doing the off-farm or the public good assessments for economics as well. They all do hydrologic modeling, so looking at the flow-weighted mean concentrations, for example. And 2 sites in Canada, the South Tobacco Creek site in Manitoba and one in Eastern Canada, are also doing integrated modeling, taking the hydrologic and economic models and putting them together so that we can do kind of a least cost BMP scenarios to achieve desired environmental outcomes as a modeling exercise. Now I guess you can't see everything that's on here, but I just want to mention that partnerships are a really, really big part of WEB's, and we have over 70 partners through the 9 sites across Canada, and there's been a lot of research published, about 45 peer-reviewed research articles in journals, and I do have lists of those in case anyone is interested. And during the coffee break, I'm going to take some of that information and set it out so that people can pick it up. We also have a webs management team, which I guess I am part of, and as a liaison, part of my job is to take the research findings and get them into a communication format that's good for the policy people within agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and anyone who's making policy decisions, and also helping out with some of the outreach. So we do have a website in case you're interested. There's information there that describes which BMPs are being researched across Canada. So if you're interested in some of the Eastern Canada ones, I'm not covering those today, you can go to our website. We've also started to make research summaries from the published research. And Dr. Jim Miller is a research scientist with Research Branch out of Lethbridge, and he's the lead of the Lower Little Bow River Web's Watershed group. And he's going to have a poster downstairs, so I will have some literature available down there later on. I guess we'll be doing that at the coffee break. So just to get into the Western Canada sites and which BMPs are being done, I'll start with the newest one in the west, Pipestone Creek, Saskatchewan. The research lead is Dr. Barbara Cade Menon with Research Branch out of Swift Current. And as you can see, there's many partners, too many people to mention on one slide. But we do have 3 different local farm families that the research is being conducted on their farms. And this watershed is located in southeast Saskatchewan, near south of Whitewood. And the 4 BMPs that they're studying are nutrient management on annual cropland, conversion of annual cropland to perennial forages, an infield winter bale grazing on pasture study, as well as a wetland restoration study. Moving on to Manitoba, to the South Tobacco Creek watershed. This is about 150 kilometers southwest of Winnipeg, near the town of Miami, Manitoba. And it's led by Jimmy Rotsky, and he's a hydrological engineer with Agri-Environment Services Branch. And there's many partners. The Deerwood Soil and Water Management Group has been a very active group in Manitoba, and they had over 40 years of monitoring information, and they have a really huge database of all of the fields in the watershed and what exact crops have been planted in every year and what inputs have gone in there. And so there was a very good base of knowledge there to start with, and as you can see, many partners. They're assessing 5 BMPs in that watershed. So one of them was conservation tillage compared to conventional tillage. They've also, that watershed has a lot of water erosion, and a lot of dams were built in the 70s and early 80s, and so they studied the effects of the small watersheds on holding back nutrients. And they also are looking at a holding pond that's designed to capture the runoff from a cattle winter feeding area. And the other 2 BMPs are conversion of annual cropland to perennial forage, and they're doing a winter processed bale grazing on annual cropland in winter study as well. And another more recently published study that's quite interesting is probably one of the first in Canada to look at a very small watershed where they've implemented 5 BMPs and actually measured at the outflow the change in water quality. And so this small watershed was compared to one a little bit further north, and they had about 4 or 5 years of pre-BMP data collected from both those watersheds, and so they would be able to tell if there was any sort of weather or climatic differences there, or what was actually attributed to BMPs. So that's another one that was recently published. Now you'll be able to go to Dr. Jim Miller's poster downstairs to find out more about the Lower Little Bow River. There's a lot of partners there, and I know some of them are here today. This watershed, of course, is located near Lethbridge, and a lot of research being done along the Little Bow River. So several BMPs being studied. There's an upstream, downstream study on stream bank fencing, so comparing keeping the cattle out of the river compared to letting them access the river for drinking, and that included some fish surveys. They also studied off-stream watering without fencing, so they were looking at some of the soils around where cattle access the river compared to the soils around the off-stream watering sites. They also looked at tame and native grass buffers along the river, and mixed grass and shelter belt experiment. And they also looked at an annual cropland conversion to perennial forages as well. And Salmon River Watershed. This one is led by Bruce Rodan with Agri-Environmental Services branch out of Kamloops, and again, many partners. This watershed, well, the Salmon River drains into Shuswap Lake, and it's near Salmon Arm. Under the first phase of WEBS, they did a fencing study and some other watershed scale studies, and in the current phase of WEBS, they're looking at irrigation efficiency BMPs. They also did some other watershed scale studies where they looked at benthic macroinvertebrates or aquatic insect communities throughout the watershed, and they were relating that to intensity of agriculture in the surrounding landscape, as well as the, I guess, some of the in-stream characteristics and the riparian area characteristics as well. And they also did some bacterial source tracking work to try and determine how much of the pathogens or E. coli in the water was from cattle compared to other, I guess, other sources of bacteria. I just want to conclude with just some thoughts about watershed scale place-based research. And of course, I mean, any research can influence, you know, farm, industry, policy, and program decision makers. Within WEBS, I'll just give one example of this, is the South Nation watershed in Ontario did some controlled tile drainage research where they found that the controls reduced the nutrient loading at the field scale and at the watershed outlet. And they also found by doing that they got slight increases in their crop yields, which would pay back the cost of those control structures after about 3 or 4 years. And prior to the research being done, the National Farm Stewardship Program funding, which farmers can apply for to get funded to do these types of BMPs, wasn't funding that particular BMP. It wasn't maybe considered a BMP at that time, and now because this research has been done, it is being funded now. So I guess that's just a direct WEBS example of having some influence on policy and programming. Just some other thoughts on WEBS as place-based watershed scale research. Of course, there's greater public demand for greater environmental stewardship by farms, particularly when it comes to drinking water sources or lakes. There's a lot of issues there in many watersheds, and it seems to me like the place-based and watershed scale research, it can support the ag sector's social license to operate, and it can, you know, help producers who may be under increasing public scrutiny for what they're doing. When you do watershed scale research and you can try and identify what some of the other sources are in a watershed that are non-agricultural, it can help put into perspective just the, I guess, severity of what the agricultural pollution is. And I'll just use Salmon River as an example of that, because when they started off, I mean, a lot of people kind of point their finger at cattle industry for pathogens getting into water. And so when they did the bacterial source tracking study, what they were able to determine, they used 2 different DNA type methods, and they were able to determine that about 20% of the E. coli was coming from cattle, and about 62% was coming from the wildlife. And out of the 62% that was coming from the wildlife, about 52% of the 62% was from avian species. And then they were able to determine, you know, how much was from human, canine, and then of course there's always some unknown that you can't identify. So I think, you know, that really helps to put in perspective for the cattle industry in that part of BC. You know, it's not all agriculture's problem. There's other contributors to that. Also, with some of our WEBS groups, while in South Tobacco Creek, they did some sediment fingerprinting or sediment source tracking work, and the preliminary results of that has been showing that quite a bit of the sediments are actually coming from the in-stream processes within the watershed, and not as much from agriculture as what maybe people expected. So it's kind of exciting research that has been a big question in the ag community for a long time, and that research is being expanded across some of the other websites in Canada that'll start up, I think, this coming growing season. And I guess with that, I guess I could just maybe just conclude by saying, you know, agri-environmental issues are complex, and in many cases the solutions are going to require action by all of the stakeholders in the watershed and not just with agriculture. So having this watershed scale research is really good. I guess one other thing I was going to say about Salmon River too is they looked at the water quality throughout the entire watershed, and so when they did their fencing studies, of course they had the upstream and downstream study, which showed that you know, E. coli could be significantly reduced with fencing, and same with the in-stream sediment suspensions. And so based on that research, people might think, oh, the cattle impact in this watershed is really bad, but really when you look at the overall water quality throughout the whole watershed and those data within that, and then you also look at the BC water quality guidelines for aquatic life, most of the parameters that were tested for, and there was numerous different types of nutrients and forms of nutrients tested, most were all below the water quality guidelines of BC Ministry of Environment, and there was a few that were above, but just very marginally above, so it kind of helps to put the context of these issues into some kind of perspective. So I'll just take any questions anybody has.
Can you go back to the Salmon Arm watershed, please?
Yeah.
So what is the impact, because I know people that have it, like the recreational use and the marina, the shuswaps, and is the watershed going towards the shuswaps?
Yeah, the Salmon River starts in, let's see,
right
is there
here
a, okay, great.
Because there is a...
So
yeah.
This would be the headwaters
Yes.
of the Salmon River, and then it flows through a bunch of communities and into Shuswap Lake.
Because there was a concern, I know, the last couple of years, you know, the marinas at the Sycamoose and stuff, oh, they're just going to put a marina in there, and they're just sort of, like, there was those kind of things, and then also the recreational cabin people that are just dumping their waste into the, and that's conflicting also with, you're trying to do it from what's the agriculture impact and all these other impacts, but there is a lot of impacts that are non-agriculture that people aren't considering.
Yeah, and I can't speak specifically to Shuswap Lake itself because I'm not that familiar, but in the early 90s I was leading a pilot project in Saskatchewan at Big Shell Lake and under Agri-Food Innovation Fund, and we were able to look at the agricultural impacts and also anything else within the watershed that could be impacting. So we had went out to the community, kind of had formed a bit of a science team of some different government agencies and Ducks Unlimited and some other groups, and then we met up with people from the community and people who worked in the RMs within the watershed and the villages along the lake as well. And so it was interesting because you had all these different stakeholders from all these different groups, and so there were farmers, there were cabin owners, and you can imagine some of this going on and stuff. And people would, you know, want to know, well, they'd have ideas, well, we think this is, you know, we think the cattle are the issue, we think the sheep are an issue, we think the cabin owners have leaking septic tanks, and on and on. And so we'd try and study some of these things through monitoring that was done, and it was quite interesting. I took a plane ride over the watershed one day because we'd been and seen where the garbage dump was and where the people with cabins had septic tanks, and they would empty the septic tanks and then dump them about a kilometer away in a lagoon, which everybody assumed was a constructed, regulated, well thought out and planned and constructed lagoon. And I went flying with a local farmer so I could take air photos of all of these things, and I honestly couldn't see this thing from the air, and when I finally realized where it was, well, it was bone dry. So obviously all of the effluent was going straight back. And so then we put in some basometers and did some monitoring there, and so there were some big changes in the community. They, you know, took quite a few years because it's very costly, but they did put in some proper waste disposal lagoons after that. And we did have money through the program to work with the producers who wanted to work with us, and we did some corral relocations and made some holding ponds for corrals to capture the nutrients from over the winter and different projects like that. So from that experience, like, I know working at things at a watershed scale, you can really make a lot of progress in dealing with the issues and really understanding exactly what they are. Whereas a lot of times with agriculture, we get funding to look only at agriculture. Exactly. So that's one of the strengths, I think, of the WEBS program is it's still all tied to agriculture, but at least we can do things like sediment source tracking or bacterial source tracking and try and get a broader perspective. And you know, who knows? And you know, who knows what the future could hold? But you know, it would be nice if we had even more partners coming on that would look at the non-agriculture things, even if they were kind of just doing it in tandem and not necessarily part of our group, but just looking at those things, it would certainly shed a lot more light on what's going on in the watersheds. So, anyways, thank you.